the subject that we're speaking about this evening, Frederick Douglass reacting to the death of Robert E. Lee, and not just his death, but kind of the legacy of the life of Lee, his Civil War service, and all of the other stuff that goes along with that. And as you might imagine, if you've seen the title, Douglass's words, "Pray for oblivion to his memory." I feel like that's an overarching theme that you will see, is that Douglass, really his idea of the legacy of Lee is to try to sort of strip away the iconography associated with Lee, to take away this idea that he is the central figure of the Civil War. And Douglass really did feel that, kind of to use a modern term, Lee was overrated in a sense. He felt that Lee, being on the losing side of the conflict, was unfortunately in his eyes kind of seen above and beyond people like Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant or other United States Army commanders or politicians throughout the course of the Civil War. And what I think we will really take away from this subject this evening, above anything else, is that a lot of what Douglass says and a lot of the responses to it will sound quite like what you see and read and hear today as far as people's interactions with one another over controversies of the Civil War era and its legacy. And so I just want to say up front that my goal isn't really to comment upon things happening today. And of course, suddenly this subject has become, over the past few months, extraordinarily relevant to our national discussion. How do we remember the Confederacy and the Civil War, and specifically, in most cases, Robert E. Lee? I don't really want to use that to give you an idea of my impressions or anyone's impressions today. But this will sound quite familiar, Douglass's words, to what we see and read today. And what I hope that serves as a reminder of is that all of the discussions and the debates and the squabbles we have with one another are nothing more than unfinished conversations among participants of the Civil War generations themselves. And so I hope this will be insightful to give you a sense perhaps of how we got to where we are today, where we can't agree on so many aspects of how we look at the Civil War, its legacy, its memory, and in particular, that of Lee. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you to have some images along the way. There we go. All right. So here we have, pray for oblivion to his memory. We'll get to that idea, that quotation in a little while. But basically, to give you a sense of what exactly we're looking at tonight, I'll go briefly through kind of a joint biography of these two men. I would assume that, of course, in a setting like this, in a Civil War roundtable, you're all familiar with these two men. In particular, I would assume Lee in the military context. But I just want to give you a sense of who are they and how do we get to a point where one of these iconic figures in the form of Douglass is commenting upon the legacy of this other iconic figure in the form of Lee, who died October 12th, 1870, 150 years ago, 2 days ago. Today, October 14th, was the day that a lot of newspapers really started reporting on the death of Lee a couple of days earlier. To begin, I want to take us to two sites that are associated, one with each of these men, both located near our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. On the left-hand side, a location I'm sure many of you have been, Arlington National Cemetery, particularly the Arlington House, associated with Lee, who lived there for the better part of 3 decades or so, marrying into the famous Custis family. And on the right-hand side, Douglass's last home, that at Cedar Hill in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And today, that is the site of the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. Now, we're going to kind of begin and end with this idea of place. These two men, as best I can tell, were never in the same place at the same time. But they both had a very similar view of the nation's capital. And here we have this idea, if you look on the left side, the western side of the map, Arlington, Lee's home for, as I mentioned, about 30 years. And to the southeastern side of your map, Cedar Hill. And when you go to each of those locations, the home of Lee, the home of Douglass, these are the views that you have, looking upon basically the same portion of the District of Columbia from 2 different directions. You can see, for instance, in both of those images, the United States Capitol building. And I think this is an interesting and intriguing way to look at these two men, is that they're looking at this same place. They're looking at maybe symbolically at the top of the Capitol dome, the statue of Lady Liberty on top of it. But here are two men looking at that national Capitol just as they looked at so many issues of the Civil War era from two completely different directions. And someone who has written a lot about this subject, I'm sorry, let me go back here, from Lee's perspective, is Jonathan Horn, who wrote a biography of Lee called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, taking the idea that George Washington was the man who would not be king, and Lee is the man who would never quite be Washington. He does not win his revolution, if you will. And when you go to Arlington National Cemetery, the Arlington House in particular, and you're standing in the lawn and you look down toward the center of the District of Columbia, what you basically see is the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the National Capitol, all in this seemingly perfect line. And Horn says that this is Arlington's secret. The line connecting Lincoln to Washington to freedom appears so straight because the house, Arlington House, lies not upon it. Lee stares down from the flank, a river away on a path not taken. And that is in many ways how Douglass looked at Lee in the aftermath of Lee's life, as we will see. He was an individual who was educated at the expense of the American people, he says, at West Point Military Academy, rises through the ranks of the United States Army, and ultimately, at his nation's gravest crisis, Lee defects to the other side. And ultimately, what we will see is that Douglass will use Arlington as a place to reflect upon the meaning, particularly of the death of U.S. soldiers who died, many of them at the hands of soldiers who fought under Lee. And so that'll give you kind of a nice sense of the symbolic way that we can look at the place of these two individuals. Now, to kind of go briefly over a joint biography of sorts here, Lee is 11 years Douglass's senior. Lee is born on January 19th, 1807. Douglass is born sometime in February 1818. We don't know exactly when. He usually decided to celebrate his birthday on Valentine's Day. Purportedly, he remembered one of his few remembrances of his mother was her calling him my little Valentine. And so he decided to go with that. Douglass actually thought his entire life he was born in 1817. He goes his entire life thinking he is a year older than he actually was. But there are these striking contrasts between these two men as they're growing up. Lee is born into the aristocratic South. He's the son of a venerated Revolutionary War general who was a friend of George Washington, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Lee's maternal grandfather was once considered to be the wealthiest man in America. Meanwhile, you have Frederick Douglass, born enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he would never know the identity of his father. In 1829, at age 22, Lee will graduate second in his class at West Point, and he's promoted to captain in 1838, which is coincidentally the same year that Douglass escaped from slavery in Baltimore, Maryland, to freedom at age 20. Douglass will escape to New York in 1838, then he goes to Massachusetts. He changes his name from his birth name of Frederick Bailey to that of Frederick Douglass. And Lee, all the while, is serving these occupations in a military capacity, part of the Engineer Corps of the U.S. Army. He's building fortifications in South Carolina. He undergoes an assignment to the Chief Engineer's Office in Washington, D.C. He has tenures in Virginia and Michigan, in Ohio, in Missouri, New York. And Douglass, all the while, is working at a Massachusetts shipyard, joining the abolitionist circuit under William Lloyd Garrison, the Garrisonian abolitionists. Now, Lee will serve in the Mexican-American War, of course, 1846 to 1848. He gets 3 promotions along the way, including a commendation from General Winfield Scott, who called Lee the very best general I ever saw in the field. At the same time, Douglass is in the process of escaping his country, if you will. His first autobiography comes out, and he sort of temporarily emigrates to Europe. When it is published, called The Narrative of an American Slave, Douglass names names. He names places. He makes himself basically a marked man. This is the land of the fugitive slave law at this point in time. And so there are people searching for Douglass in the aftermath of his flight. And so he goes to Europe for a while until his freedom is officially purchased by some English abolitionists. He returns to New York. He starts the North Star newspaper in Rochester, and he begins a friendship with John Brown. And this is going to be the first moment that we sort of see Lee and Douglass on this interesting course where their acquaintances and their courses of their careers will kind of intersect with one another. When Douglass becomes a friend to John Brown, there will be this meeting between Brown and Douglass in the summer of 1859, just before Brown will raid Harper's Ferry. And this will occur in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles west of Gettysburg. And as Douglass later remembered, he told Brown at this meeting that he would not join him in this raid on Harper's Ferry because he feared that Brown was going into what Douglass called a perfect steel trap. And what do we know happens, of course, is that Brown is in fact arrested. And who is he arrested by? United States Army Colonel Robert E. Lee. And so here we have this interesting moment where these two men are on opposite sides of Brown's journey to Harper's Ferry, and of course his ultimate execution as a result of that. Now, during this period, we also see in the antebellum years that Lee is going to return from Mexico in the 1850s. He is assigned for a time to Douglass's one-time home city of Baltimore. He gets a 3-year tenure as superintendent at West Point, and Douglass is beginning this kind of increased involvement in the now political anti-slavery movement. He's aiding fugitive enslaved people. He'll deliver his famous 4th of July oration, What to the American Slave is the 4th of July, and he publishes a second autobiography as well. Now, as we approach the Civil War years, we find Lee in Texas as southern states are beginning to file their ordinances of secession, and he's called back to Washington. He resides from the U.S. Army, joins Virginia state troops, and eventually the Confederacy. And in the meantime, what Lee is saying about disunion famously is that, quote, a union that can only be maintained by swords and bayonets, and in which strife and civil war are to take the place of brotherly love and kindness, has no charm for me. If the union is dissolved, says Lee, and the government disrupted, I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people, and save and defense will draw my sword on none. So here we have the man who will ultimately secede, deriding the idea of secession, but also deriding the idea of a union that could only be kept together by war. On the flip side of things, we have Frederick Douglass, a staunch unionist and eventual, of course, staunch emancipationist as the war goes down that road. But he is welcoming the idea of secession for this reason. Douglass says just after Fort Sumter is fired upon in May 1861, quote, as a friend of freedom, earnestly laboring for the abolition of slavery, we have no tears to shed, no lamentations to make over the fall of Fort Sumter. The slave owners themselves have exposed the throat of slavery to the keen knife of liberty, and have given a chance to all the righteous forces of the nation to deal a death blow to the monster evil. He who faithfully works to put down a rebellion undertaken and carried on for the extension and perpetuity of slavery performs an anti-slavery work. Lee will resign on April 19, 1861, 2 days after Virginia, his home state, filed its ordinance of secession, stating, quote, the federal government has perverted powers, not only to the injury of the people of Virginia, but to the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. And Lee is going to leave Arlington for Richmond at the beginning of May. His wife Mary and the rest of their family will remain until the occupation of the property by United States forces in mid-May 1861. He accepts the command of Virginia state forces, and then he will be promoted famously to lead the Army of Northern Virginia on June 2nd, 1862. All the while, Douglass will have this increased influence throughout the North. As a newsman, he emphasizes his wishes for a true radicalization of the Union war effort toward emancipation, and he criticizes Lincoln strongly until, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation is filed in 1863. Now, as the war goes on, Lee will lead his army, of course, to repeated victories, often early, especially pre-Gettysburg, to victories against overwhelming, usually numerically inferior odds. And Douglass, all the while, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation is put into effect, he becomes a United States Army recruiter. He becomes the father of 3 soldiers. He lectures repeatedly on the Civil War, or as he called it, one of 3 names, the Abolition War, the Slaveholders' Rebellion, or the Emancipation War. He becomes a staunch Lincoln ally and effectively a presidential confidant. He meets with Lincoln in 1863 and again in 64 twice in the White House. The third time they will meet is right at the end of the conflict, the day that Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, which Douglass called more a sermon than a state paper, and told Lincoln to him at the reception after the inauguration that in his words, that was a sacred effort. Douglass is then going to, at the end of the war, be at Faneuil Hall in Boston, which was the famous site where he had delivered his 4th of July oration in 1852, I believe that was. But he returns then in 1865, right at the end of the war, on April 4th. Richmond has just fallen a couple of days earlier after the breakthrough at Petersburg. And Douglass says this: I, for the first time in my life, have the assurance, not only of a country redeemed, of a country regenerated, but of my race free and having a future in this land. I say we have in the fall of Richmond, the fall of this terrible rebellion, and the upbuilding of liberty through the southern states. Lee will surrender less than a week later at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9th, return shortly thereafter to Richmond, where his family will live temporarily amid a sea of these kind of sad Southerners. There are all these Confederate sympathizers there. There's a famous image of the burning of Richmond there. That's the city that Lee is coming back to, as this city of ruins. A few days earlier is when Abraham Lincoln had passed through Richmond, and all of these formerly enslaved people are kind of bowing at the president's feet. This is quite a different scene that Lee is returning to a few days later. Now, when Lee surrenders, Douglass is going to be at the Rochester City Hall, at his adopted home city in Rochester, New York, on April 15th, 1865. And this is the day that Abraham Lincoln died after having been shot at Ford's Theater the night before. And while Douglass is there, he talks about the dreadful disaster that has befallen the nation, in his words. He talks about this being a day for silence and meditation, for grief and tears. But he told his audience that though Lincoln dies, the republic lives. And then his words became a little more forceful toward how the United States should immediately reflect upon Lee and the Confederacy. Douglass said this: if treason expects to gain anything by this hell-black assassination, it will be awfully disappointed. And if it teaches us this lesson, it may be that the blood of our beloved martyred president will be the salvation of our country. Now, in the process of this speech, he is going to give this kind of joking, in a sense, thought on how Lee is being looked at by the country. And he talks about how just the other day it seemed as if the nation were in danger of losing a just appreciation of the awful crimes of this rebellion. We were manifesting almost as much gratitude to General Lee for surrendering as to General Grant for compelling him to surrender. And apparently, according to the reporter's notes, this line is met by cheers, followed thereafter by Douglass saying, "It seemed to me the other day that General Lee was about the most popular man in America." And this will be met apparently by, according to the reporter, by applause and laughter. But Douglass does tell his audience on a much more serious note that in his views, the likes of Lee and rebel leaders possessed hands red with the best blood of the land. Republics have proverbially short memories. I was afraid the American people were growing weak. Let us not be in too much haste in the work of restoration. He said that idea, that being in a hurry to, quote, clasp to our bosom our former enemies, was the spirit which gave birth to John Wilkes Booth. And so Douglass does feel as though there is a line to walk, and it's a very thin one, but people have to look more toward the idea, in his view, of retribution rather than reconciliation in this immediate aftermath of the war. And he puts Lee squarely at the center of how people should look at the conflict and its legacy. Now, in 1866, the next year, Lee is by then president of Washington College, today Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Lee said that when he accepted the job, he feared that he, quote, might draw upon the college a feeling of hostility. And that was, in fact, the case from some in the Northern press. Douglass turned toward remembrance of the war as his primary speaking theme at about this time. And basically what we will see is that Douglass is at the First Presbyterian Church in Washington on February 13th, 1866. And he gives this speech about the assassination and its lessons, talking about the assassination of Lincoln. Now, remember what we just heard a moment ago is that there was this kind of jest that Douglass is giving to his audience, that Lee might be the most famous man in America, the most popular man in America. We might thank him more so than we did General Grant for compelling Lee to surrender. He will say almost that exact same thing on this occasion, but in a much more serious tone. He says in Washington in February 1866, looking back to the year prior, as at no time before the loyal people were rejoicing in victory, Richmond had fallen. Lee, commanding an army composed of the elite of the South, had surrendered to Grant. The people were already beginning to manifest a desire to conciliate. And that maudlin magnanimity, which means basically a mushy generosity, that is now our greatest danger. It was becoming fashionable to speak of rebel generals in terms of highest respect. And men were almost as thankful to Lee for surrender as to Grant for making him surrender. And in the reporter's notes, there is no laughter this time. His tone must have been much more serious. And then Douglass asks the very big, kind of weighty question: what did leniency avail? Was the iron heart of slavery softened by it? No, nor ever will it be. Nothing will ever soften it, save the military power of the United States. And of course, here we are in the midst of Reconstruction by this period, where there is, in fact, this U.S. military power going through the South. And Lee will call that a great evil, in his words, at one point in time. Another way to look at how Douglass and Lee look at the Civil War very differently, and I'll just touch on this briefly here, is that in 1869, they were both invited to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to speak at the site of Lee's greatest defeat, one could argue, and of course the costliest location of the entire American Civil War. Lee is invited later in the year for a blue-gray reunion, very kind of gutsy move on behalf of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association to have just 4 years after the war, 6 years after the battle, a blue-gray reunion. And it's largely unsuccessful. Hundreds of Union veterans will show up. As best I can tell, only 2, maybe 3 Confederates showed up. But in his denial of the request to come, Lee will give us this idea of how he thinks about this war. And he tells the people that invited him to this reunion that they should, quote, follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife and commit to oblivion the feelings it engendered. On the contrary, Douglass earlier in the year had been invited in January 1869, and he came to Gettysburg. We don't have the exact text of the speech that he gave, but we do have other texts of that same speech from around that time, one of which was actually delivered in Cleveland in 1868, just before the end of the year. And what Douglass tells his audience is that the Civil War must be remembered. Deplore it as we must, said Douglass. War, stern and terrible war, seems to be the inexorable condition exacted for every considerable addition made to the liberties of mankind. For not only should men think of their liberty in order to properly prize it, but they should bear in mind the tremendous hardships by which it has been achieved. So here we have Lee, the man who led an army at that battlefield and in this war, saying we should commit to oblivion the feelings that this war engendered. And here we have Douglass, this kind of conscience of the nation in a sense, certainly of African Americans across the United States, saying, no, we must remember the war. And at the end of that segment of that speech, he says this: the line over which oppression may not go may be marked with ink, but it must be marked with blood, reminding his audience that it was important for presidents and Congress to issue proclamations and amendments and declarations in, as he says, ink, but that line of oppression must also be marked with blood, the blood of battle, the blood of soldiers, and the blood of remembering this Civil War. And this leads us to Lee's death on October 12th, 1870, 150 years ago this week. By this point in time, Douglass is editing the 4th newspaper that he did throughout his life, the New National Era, and this would be the final from 1870 to about 1874. And Douglass will print what we would today call a series of op-eds. And they're basically organized as though they are obituaries, but they are not in the slightest bit favorable toward the subject of their remembrance, as you can see right here. The headline on October 20th, 1870, just 8 days after Lee has died, is this: death of a perjured traitor. And what Douglass says here, as you can see, is Robert E. Lee, one of the chief rebel generals, died on Wednesday of congestion to the brain. And then he goes right into railing against Lee's legacy. We have no sympathy to waste, said Douglass, not a regret to express over the death of this arch apostate. Whatever might have been his course previous to the rebellion, there is not an act of his life since the day he drew his sword against his country that commends him to the forbearance of loyal men, or in the slightest degree palliates his enormous crime. He would go on in the course of this same opinion piece to say that Lee was educated at the expense of the people, but he basely falsified his oath, violated obligations of fidelity, and turned the experience he had acquired at the public expense against the government in its first hour of danger. He talked about the quote-unquote baseness of General Lee's treason. And I think the important thing to consider here is that these are, of course, very incendiary remarks. And in many quarters, both then and now, it's blasphemous to speak such ill terms toward Robert E. Lee. And I think one of the valid questions we should ask is, what exactly is it that we should take out of this? Why should we listen to Douglass and his thoughts and feelings? And I think that might hopefully speak for itself to this point. We've seen Douglass's life experience, maybe more so in his form than in that of any other single person of the Civil War era. We have this kind of encapsulation of all the Civil War's causes and consequences. A man born into slavery who escaped to freedom, became a famous abolitionist and orator and presidential confidant and recruiter of U.S. soldiers, including 3 of his own sons. And now in the aftermath of the conflict, sort of serving as this figure who is telling his countrymen to not be so much in the haste of the work of reconciliation, but to bear in mind, who is it that we hold in high regards? And of course, as we can see here, he's saying that Lee is, in his eyes, not that person. This will go on. A couple of weeks later, on November 4th, 1870, Douglass is going to be delivering a speech. Pardon me, I lost my place here. Going to be delivering a speech in which he's talking about being a member of the Progressive Republican Party, in his words, which, of course, while the parties haven't flipped necessarily on the issues of the day, they're quite different than now, of course, but Douglass considers himself a progressive and Democrats to be conservatives. And he talks about himself being a member of this party. And he says that former rebels have done nothing for the betterment of the country in the aftermath of the war. He says that Lee and others did everything that they could to fight against the betterment of a reunited states. And of course, that is not entirely true. Lee is, at least in his public utterances, very reconciliatory, very much willing to come back into the fold as a United States citizen. But in the course of this, Douglass gets very upset. And he says this: nothing has shown the undying hatred of the rebels against the Union more clearly than the rebel mourning over the death of Robert E. Lee. He would also mention that at this point in time, the Republican Party will have living issues with the Democratic Party until the last rebel is dead and buried, he says, until the last nail of the last coffin of the last rebel is driven. And so we can now see the idea that Lee is this figurehead for former Confederates in Douglass's eyes, and that he's also attacking this from a political perspective as well. Douglass will publish a piece on November 10th, less than a week after he delivered that anti-Democrat, anti-Lee speech. And this is under the headline of Bombast. Now, what he did was reprinted a piece from another newspaper in between the two excerpts that you can see here. But what you're seeing are Douglass's own words. And he asks this question to his audience: is it not about time that this bombastic laudation of the rebel chief should cease? We can scarcely take up a paper that comes to us from the South that is not filled with nauseating, and you can see italicizes that word, flatteries of the late Robert E. Lee. And many northern journals also join in these undeserved tributes to his memory. We're beginning to get at the cause of General Lee's death, says Douglass. Jeff Davis, of course, former Confederate president, says that he, quote, died of a broken heart. And that was a very common thing. Lee dies of congestion to the brain, but also has a condition called angina. And a lot of people said that this blocking of his arteries, this literal heart disease, was almost as if he was dying of a broken heart. And as Douglass says, one journal has declared he died being sadly depressed at the condition of the country, that he could stand it no longer, from which we are to infer that the liberation of 4 million of slaves and their elevation to manhood and to the enjoyment of their civil and political rights was more than he could stand, and so he died. Very strong words, almost a bit of harsh sarcasm there in a sense. Now, what Douglass and others are resorting to here are these attacks on Lee's racial record. And of course, Lee was a man who had inherited enslaved people at the Arlington plantation and who had written and said many things, including the utterances that you see in front of you here throughout the course of his life. Very much a man of his moment in the aristocracy of Virginia. Certainly among the Confederate high command, there is an inclination toward being very much pro-slavery and in the aftermath of the conflict, anti-civil rights. Some of the famous utterances of Lee would include in 1856, he says, the blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, physically, and socially. In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, Lee writes a note to Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon on January 10th, just 9 days after the proclamation had been issued. He's talking specifically about the military policy of the proclamation in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. But I think it's really no secret what he might mean when he says we should save the honor of our families from pollution and our social system from destruction. Lee would say in 1864 that it is, quote, necessary for us to use our Negroes in this war if we would maintain ourselves and prevent them from being employed against us. I'm confident that our people will contribute this species of property. After the end of the war, Lee will go home upon visiting a cousin, Thomas Carter. One of Lee's sons later related that Lee said in June 1865, I have always observed that wherever you find the Negro, everything is going down around him. And wherever you find the white man, you see everything around him improving. Lee tells Congress in 1866 when he's testifying before a joint committee in the United States House of Representatives that he said, I do not think that the black man is as capable of acquiring knowledge as the white man is. I think it would be better for Virginia if she could get rid of them. And finally, Lee signs this document called the White Sulphur Manifesto, which is curiously authored in part by William Rosecrans, former Union general, of course. And in it, Lee is one of the first signatories that this idea that, quote, Negroes have neither the intelligence nor other qualifications which are necessary to make them safe depositories of political power. And Douglass would give us these ideas of his opposition to Lee on the grounds of race many times. There's also this curious account that is published around this time as well. Now, Lee was still alive when this purportedly happened, but in May 1867, this comes from a later history of the Ku Klux Klan published in the 1920s, and so it should probably be taken with a grain of salt, but I mention it solely for the fact that it does exist. Douglas Southall Freeman mentioned this account in his biography of Lee in the 1930s, that purportedly in 1867, there's a group of individuals who attend the first convention of the Klan in Nashville, Tennessee. And they apparently go, as you can see the account mentions here, to Lee. And Lee says, I would like to assist you in any plan that offers relief. I cannot be with you, but I will follow you, but must be kept invisible. And then according to this account, it's also Lee who on that occasion recommends Nathan Bedford Forrest as, quote, the only man I know who could lead so large a body of men successfully. Now, I don't know of any historians who have taken this account entirely seriously. Like I said, the source is somewhat in question, and the fact that it is written so long after the fact should be questioned as well. But Douglass does feel as though, in his eyes, Lee is certainly associating himself with the likes of the Klan in this post-war Reconstruction era South. We'll also see Douglass attack around this time Jefferson Davis, former Confederate president. And he asks the question at the bottom of this little opinion piece here of what is Mr. Davis president? Is the Confederacy still alive? And what he's speaking to is that Davis had just delivered a speech in Richmond, Virginia at the Lee Memorial Convention. So here we have just a couple of weeks after Lee died, these plans to create a monument to him. And that becomes a target for Douglass as well, this idea of having Lee memorials. He opposes that rather early on as well. And he has a problem with the fact that these former Confederates are leading these efforts to erect memorials to the legacy of Lee. And Douglass will talk a bit more specifically about that idea from December 1st, 1870. He says this: the Southern rebels are boiling over a patriotic determination to erect a monument to the memory of the traitor Robert E. Lee in every Southern state. But it will be a great waste of money, for it is utterly unnecessary to resort to any such means to perpetuate his memory. He goes on this line of thinking that becomes really popular among Union veterans at Gettysburg a couple of decades later. In 1903, before the Virginia Memorial was dedicated in 1917, which has Lee on top of it on Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania proposed a monument to Lee. And one of the main things that people said against it, as far as Union veterans, was that it would be no different than putting up a statue in their eyes of Judas or Benedict Arnold or John Wilkes Booth. And Douglass seems to maybe have originated this idea a couple of decades earlier. In 1870, he says, "It has been more than 1,800 years since Judas Iscariot betrayed the Savior. But though we have never heard of a monument being erected in honor of his deed, his name and fame are as fresh in the memory of the world as though there had been one as enduring as the pyramids in every country on the globe. And no such exhibition of admiration has been required to keep alive the name of Benedict Arnold. More than 100 years have passed since his treason to his country, and no American has ever forgotten him or ever will. No fear that Lee will be more fortunate," Douglass concludes. "His friends ought rather to pray for oblivion to his memory than the perpetuation of his infamy." Again, this very opinionated, very kind of hard-hitting op-ed that Douglass publishes. And then he speaks even more specifically. That same exact day, at a different column of the same paper, talks about what he calls monuments of folly. "We do not mean to encourage in these columns favorable or unfavorable criticisms in respect to the rebel General Lee." I think that Douglass's language would say otherwise. He says, "He is dead, and so is Benedict Arnold. And impartial history will assign to R.E. Lee his true place in this world's affairs while he lived. But if his unwise friends shall cast their eyes upon this paper, we commend to their careful perusal the following." And it will be this piece about remembering Lee, how he should be remembered in Douglass's eyes. A couple of weeks later, Douglass prints another kind of sarcastic piece under a headline, "Wit and Wisdom." It's all these little kind of joking pieces that we see oftentimes in 19th century newspapers. And he talks about how at a Sunday school in New Orleans, a teacher was examining his boys and asked him, "Who was Pontius Pilate?" And one of the boys, with a smile of triumph, exclaimed, "Oh, I know, Mr. M. He was the pilot of the R.E. Lee." And Douglass says at another point in that same column, "The demise of General Lee is developing the poetic talent of the South in a remarkable manner. Here is the way one of the gushers commences his tribute to the departed soldier." And we see all these little complaints that Douglass gets madder and madder. He questions at one point whether if Ulysses Grant would die at that exact moment, would people across the United States remember him nearly as favorably as they were remembering Lee. Now, as we draw toward a conclusion here, let's go back again to that idea of Arlington, that place where we can see the connection of Lee and Douglass. Douglass looking across to Washington, D.C. from a different direction than what Lee did when he lived in Washington, D.C. And this idea that their first connection, if we go back to that beginning idea that through the use of John Brown and that raid, and how Douglass says, "You'll be caught in a steel trap." And he is, and he's arrested by none other than Robert E. Lee. In his final memoir, Douglass, in 1881, he only mentioned Lee by name in what I can tell is 3 sections, one of which he spoke briefly of the moment when, quote, "Richmond had fallen, Grant had General Lee and the Army of Virginia firmly in his clutch at the end of the Civil War." But the other references in Douglass's autobiography were in reference to Lee's arrest of John Brown at Harper's Ferry. And according to Douglass, he mentions this story about Lee. It's the only anecdote he tells us about Lee in his entire book, is that Andrew J. Hunter, who had been in 1859 the prosecuting attorney for the state of Virginia in the John Brown case, he apparently came up to Douglass after Douglass delivered a famous speech at Harper's Ferry. This was the address in which he says that John Brown could, Douglass says, Frederick Douglass, could live for the slave, but John Brown could die for him. And apparently after he gives this speech, rather in favor of John Brown and what he did, Andrew Hunter, prosecuting attorney, the man who is largely responsible for the death sentence of John Brown, not only congratulated me upon my speech, said Douglass, but at parting he gave me a friendly grip, and added that if Robert E. Lee were alive and present, he knew he would give me his hand also. And that is quite curious. Now, where we can tie these men together most directly is at Arlington National Cemetery. And this is in 1871. And Douglass will give a speech on Decoration Day, what we today, of course, call Memorial Day. And he says on May 30th, 1871, as he stands in the shadow of Arlington Cemetery, of Arlington House, over top of the graves of Arlington Cemetery, this puts Douglass on the very property where Lee once lived to deliver this address on the memory of the conflict that defined these two men's lives and legacies. And Douglass tells his audience, we are sometimes asked, in the name of patriotism, to forget the merits of the fearful struggle and to remember with equal admiration those who struck at the nation's life and those who struck to save it, those who fought for slavery and those who fought for liberty and justice. He tells his audience, I am no minister of malice. I would not strike the fallen. I would not repel the repentant. But if I forget the difference between the parties to that terrible, protracted, and bloody conflict, may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. And so Douglass is forever going to be almost obsessed with this idea of how to remember the Civil War. How do we look at it in an emancipationist sense? Look at it not just as the conflict in which white Northerners and white Southerners came back together after it was done for reunion, but rather as a conflict that allowed people who looked like Douglass to be truly free in some sense across the American landscape. I'll end with one final anecdote, and we'll return very briefly to that Arlington speech. When Douglass dies on February 20th, 1895, 30 years after the Civil War, 25 years after Lee had died, the North Carolina State Assembly, former Confederate state, of course, had voted down legislation to make the birthday of Robert E. Lee, January 19th, a state holiday. George Washington's birthday was a holiday in North Carolina, but they vote down Robert E. Lee. Now, a month later, Douglass dies. And in the aftermath of his death, the North Carolina legislature does affirm a resolution that, quote, declared the General Assembly would adjourn in honor of Frederick Douglass. And what we see is this idea, as Douglass said in his speech at Arlington Cemetery in 1871, is that there are definitely two sides in that protracted, bloody struggle, as he called it. In a report that is reprinted in multiple newspapers, those who opposed this decree by the North Carolina legislature to adjourn in honor of Douglass pointed out that the dates representing, quote, the birth of Lee, the birth of Washington, and the death of Douglass each occurred over a 1-month span. The foregoing action is equivalent to saying, this is the Charlotte Observer saying this, Washington, Lee, Douglass, these three, but the greatest of these is Douglass. And the Charlotte Observer went on to say that, quote, the legislature has disgraced itself. In saying so, it has disgraced the state. Many periodicals in North Carolina and really across the South and the former states of the Confederacy are very quick to lob these kind of discriminatory epithets at Douglass. In many ways, much the same as, of course, he had at the aftermath of Lee, but these epithets toward Douglass are very much in a racial context. A lot of these Republican members of the North Carolina legislature who said we should honor Douglass but not Lee were called, quote unquote, fusionists by political enemies who accused progressives of seeking to fuse the black and white races together, a common Reconstruction era epithet. The Durham, North Carolina recorder opined that Washington, the father of his country, and Uncle Bob Lee, the soldier and patriot, were more American than Douglass would ever be. The Wilmington, North Carolina Star called Douglass a, quote, half-breed, and said that in refusing to honor the memory of the two greatest Americans, Washington and Lee, North Carolinians have degraded themselves. Likewise, the Wilmington Messenger suggested that the white men who voted in favor of publicly celebrating Douglass, quote, ought to be ashamed of themselves. And this gets really ugly here as a forewarning. And after blacking their faces, go out to the holes and caves and beg that they fall in upon them and hide them from the sunlight and face of all Anglo-Saxon lineage or the Aryan stock. And the Richmond Dispatch in Virginia added to the conversation by assessing, quote, the people of North Carolina should not be held responsible for the doings of the black and tan crew at present in charge at Raleigh. Another paper said that encourage its readers to, quote, not willingly forget the old adage that we should say nothing but good in reference to the dead, but only if it applied to members of the Anglo-Saxon race. And white citizens who represented the noblest products of Anglo-Saxon civilization says that paper, were worthy of acclaim. For members of other races, it is a non-issue when insult and indignation is heaped upon their names. And one after another, we will see this idea that Douglass and Lee are bound together one more time in the aftermath of Douglass's life, and almost none of it is positive. But there will be a couple of positive responses that do come out of it. There's going to be a Midwest paper, one in Iowa, the Iowa State Bystander, that printed, quote, "The fact of the legislature of North Carolina adjourning out of respect to Frederick Douglass and refusing to do the same in honor of Robert E. Lee is certainly an evidence of great progress." At a meeting of African Americans at Big Bethel Church in Atlanta, Georgia, the Reverend R.M. Cheeks admired the fact that it seemed the, quote, North Carolina legislature had put Douglass first, Washington second, and Lee third. And at that same service, one eulogist went so far as to say, Fred Douglass is ranked next to Jesus Christ. Now, I'll conclude by going back to that Arlington moment. Douglass standing in the shadow of the house once owned by Lee, the place where Lee was forced to flee. His family was forced to flee, and United States Army officers took over and started the National Cemetery there. And that last line that I left off from that a few moments ago, I would not repel the repentant, but if I forget the difference between the parties to that terrible, protracted, and bloody conflict. Douglass ended that section by saying this: I say, if this war is to be forgotten, I ask in the name of all things sacred, what shall men remember? And I think that's an issue that we still deal with to this day. How do we remember this conflict? How do we remember its participants? How do we remember the giants of that era, such as Douglass, such as Lee? And I hope that by looking at how one of these men remembered another, this will give you some sense of how perhaps we should go forward and consider many of these individuals, what they said and what they wrote. Think about them in their time, as people of their time. Think about Douglass as a maybe larger figure than perhaps he looms today, but certainly Lee's stock has not gone anywhere, and we are still debating so many of the things that Douglass said about him and so many of the responses that came his way. And so I thank you all for remembering with me this evening. I'll take some questions, and as I do so, I'll put this up, just some recommended reading. There are many biographies, of course, on Lee, many books on him, especially through his military career. There are 3 Lee books here that focus especially on some of the subjects that Douglass decided to focus on. Lee, his last years, as Charles Braceland Flood has written, from 1865 to 1867. Alan Nolan's Lee Considered, kind of a classic study of essays, putting Lee into the context of his time and thinking about these touchier issues that he dealt with. John Reeves, a relatively recent book, I think 2 years old, The Lost Indictment of Lee, talking about the treason case that never took place against Lee and other Confederates in the aftermath of the war. And on the Douglass side, I think the first place to go is the 2018 biography that you see on the very right side, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight. Earlier than that, Dr. Blight had also written Frederick Douglass's Civil War, which is, as the name implies, focusing mostly on Douglass during the Civil War period. A couple of ways you can stay in contact with me and focus if you'd like to follow along with my work there at the bottom. But I thank you all, and I'll be happy to take any questions that are there.
Applause, I assume, from everybody. Thank you very much. I think one of the first questions I got you have answered, and that is the name of your podcast, which I assume is Battles and Banter.
That is correct. Yep.
We've got that. Second question is, what's the museum you're associated with? You can blame that on the person that introduced you, but why don't you tell them about that as well, please?
You broke up a little there. You said the museum?
Yes.
Yep. Sure. So Seminary Ridge Museum, now officially called Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center as of a few months ago. Basically, we opened it in 2013 for the 150th anniversary of the battle, as I mentioned, on the campus of the historic Lutheran Seminary. This would be the brick building with the famous cupola on top of it. General John Buford used on the first day of battle, as well as some other Union Army officers and civilians, and maybe even a couple of Confederate troops as well. And what our museum largely focuses upon is the first day of the battle. We're situated right in the heart of it. We're right behind the final Union line on July 1st, 1863. So that's our 4th floor. Our 3rd floor goes into Civil War medical care, and in particular, the use of the seminary as a military hospital. For about 2.5 months after the battle, there were about 700 patients treated in and around the seminary building and the two homes that were there at the time of the battle and are still there today. And then our second floor discusses the story of religion, which is kind of a unique aspect of Civil War studies at a museum site. We are in the campus of the oldest active Lutheran seminary in the Western Hemisphere. And so a lot of the big picture issues that are at heart at the course of the Civil War are playing out, of course, in the walls of the very building where the museum is today. So we do general admission to the museum. You can go through those 3 floors. We also do, for an additional charge, tours to the cupola at the top of the building. In normal times, we also do some walking tours around the campus, focusing especially on the first day of fighting and the final Union defense. So, but it was a project many years in the making. The building was built in 1832, and it was actively used as the main seminary edifice until 1895. It was a dorm until 1954, closed for about 7 years until 1961, and then it was turned over through a lease to the Adams County Historical Society until 2011. And then the ultimate goal was to turn it into a museum, which happened on the 150th anniversary. And we've had the museum and just added an education center. When students are able to come back to doing field trips on site, they'll have a nice new facility to be able to do that at our museum as well.
Okay, and if I can add, I have been to the museum and I have been to the cupola, and it's well worth the trip, everybody. One thing I wanted to thank you for also was you used the term United States forces occupied Arlington and did not go back to that Union thing that I hate so much. Some questions that came in during the session. First of all, Bob Walcott wanted to know, what was congestion of the brain that killed Lee?
Yeah, it's an interesting line, and it really is there for for those early press accounts. And any sort of analysis of Lee's death, I don't think you oftentimes see that today in any biographies other than in quoting those early accounts. But I believe the medical condition that he officially dies of is angina, kind of blocking his arteries. And I'm wondering if the initial analysis of that, before there is this kind of definitive medical term for it, is, did the blood simply stop flowing to his brain? And that might have been how it was classified in that moment. I'm by no means a medical expert, so I could be incorrect in that. But just looking at the newspaper accounts, that's pretty popular in those first couple of days and weeks after Lee died, and then you don't really see that come up anymore. You start to see mentions of his heart failing, and as I mentioned, in a kind of symbolic sense, a lot of especially Confederate sympathizers and former Confederates talk about Lee having a broken heart. They use that official medical diagnosis as more of a poetic sense in their terms. But I can only assume it means that the blood stopped flowing to his brain because his heart stopped pumping because he had blocked arteries.
Okay, well, I just will add that our resident expert and Robert E. Lee cheerleader, Dave Carino, thinks it probably was a stroke.
Okay.
We'll let it go at that for right now. Dan Zeiser asks, what was the level of Douglass's education?
Almost entirely either self-taught or through Mrs. Auld. I believe her first name was Mary Auld. I could be mistaken. When he is enslaved at Baltimore. So he's born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and ultimately he is going to be separated from his mother and grandmother, the only two people he ever really met in his young life. He reunites with his sister later in life, but he is going to be taken to Baltimore, and oh my goodness, what was the question? I knew where I was going with that, and then I got sidetracked.
Level of education.
Level of education, thank you. So when he's in Baltimore, he is going to be educated by Mrs. Auld, and she does this. This is, of course, illegal. Even her own husband, if he would have found out about this in that moment, would have been extremely upset. She goes behind the back of her family and behind the back of the law to educate young Frederick. And ultimately, an intriguing side note to that is that when he is in Europe, after, this would be in the 1830s, 1840s, when his official abolition papers are put forward by abolitionists in in England especially, he starts this correspondence with his former enslavers in Baltimore. He becomes basically pen pals with the Auld family, using that education that he had received, by one of them to correspond with them as a formerly enslaved man, and now as a de facto leader of Black America. But yeah, that would have been it as far as any sort of formal education. There's not really any to exist. If you read Douglass's, really his first two autobiographies, but especially the first one, he makes note that he feels as though learning how to read and write was what set him free. And he thought that was the key for any enslaved person. The moment you could read or write, you were the worst possible threat imaginable to the aristocracy of the South, and particularly to those who enslaved others. And he does turn in a certain degree to physical violence, but he felt as though the pen was his most significant weapon that he had. And he ends his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, by saying, "Heaven has ordained me with three things that if I lose everything else, I still have them: my pen, my voice, and my vote." And I think that tells us how important he felt education was, even though he had never received any formally.
Okay. I have a question from Jim Heflick about, did all three sons of Douglass survive the war?
They did. Yep, they did. One of them, I forget which, I think it might be Lewis. He gets gangrene really bad. And two of his sons were in the 54th Massachusetts of Glory fame. One was actually at Fort Wagner, as best I can tell. The other was not, suffering with gangrene. But yes, it does appear that all three did survive the course of the conflict.
Okay, we've got some questions that kind of run together. So Dan Zeiser again asked, did Douglass have similar words towards Jefferson Davis as he did to Lee?
Yes, but not as harsh. The couple of times I mentioned Davis were all that I have found thus far on his feelings toward him. It seems like he mostly uses Lee, partly because he does feel as though Lee is the main person to blame for having actually led men on the battlefield. But also it seems like he's taking this kind of central beloved figurehead. And this is why I've always assumed he attacked Lee more than he did Davis, was because Lee was this universally loved figure in the aftermath of the war through the South. And even by the time he dies 5 years after the conflict, rather universally beloved throughout the North as well. And that was one of Douglass's main concerns. So it attacks him as kind of this one central figure that he knew it would maybe be more effective. Whereas Davis does have a lot of people, even in the former Confederacy, who didn't feel that he was adequate at his job. And he was, in many circles, a generally unpopular man for those first few years after the war. Plus, Douglass does see this idea that Davis was actually imprisoned for a time. Lee was never even arrested. And so Douglass does feel as though there's an injustice there. The fact that Lee was able to go take on, a private life for a time, until eventually he, of course, becomes president of Washington College. And Douglass is very much upset by that fact. He felt that there was not justice done. And so I think that probably for those reasons, he attacks Lee much more than he does any other central figure. But he does mention Davis on a few occasions, was certainly no fan of his, but doesn't feel as though there's as much of a case, it seems from his vantage point, as there was against Lee.
Well, you've sort of answered this, but our Dave Carino asks, is it really fair to condemn Lee so strenuously just because he was better at what he did than his comrades, such as Bragg or Pemberton? Picking the bottom of the barrel, Dave. And just because the vanquished Confederates idolized Lee. Lee can be rightly criticized for siding with the Confederacy, but does he deserve more condemnation than any other Confederate leaders? And before you answer that, I want to throw in a question from Lily Corte that kind of goes with it, and I'll let you talk about both of them, and I hope everybody's happy with that. Was Douglass as hostile towards those Confederates who later became Republicans, like Mosby or Longstreet, in Grant Allies and Friends?
On that last point, I was just talking last week. I did an interview that aired the other day with Kevin Bryant, ranger at Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, and he and I, after we were done doing the official portion, he asked me what other Douglass topics I was working on in general. And one of the things that I would love to explore is other military leaders, especially of the Confederacy, but even United States veterans, with whom Douglass may have corresponded or wrote about. And so I don't have an answer to that last portion. As far as if you look at a Longstreet or a Mosby, William Mahone, any sort of those figures, I would be very curious to see Douglass's feelings and thoughts on them. Now, the benefit from a source standpoint of Lee is that Douglass was writing and editing and producing a newspaper at the time of Lee's death. So that is partly why we do have so much material, is that Douglass edited the New National Era from 1870 to 74. Lee, of course, dies in 1870. Whereas those later periods, Douglass is giving speeches, but he's not, it doesn't seem as hostile, if we want to use that word, not as forthright in condemnations of these figures in that more public, personal setting of a speech as he is in the columns of a newspaper. And so just based on timing, we have so much more about Lee than we do any other figure. But I would love to see whether he did mention any of those other individuals who eventually became Republicans and Grant allies. And Grant certainly was a figure who Douglass held in the highest esteem. He holds Grant in just about higher regard than almost any other figure of the war period with whom he had any interaction. And that will continue even through Grant's presidency and then the post-war years to the end of Grant's life. Now, as far as, kind of touching on what I did before, just that idea of Lee being as good at his job as he was, that does certainly, the double side of that sword is, of course, the other edge of it is that because Lee loses, he becomes this, the figurehead of that side and the kind of the iconic figure of the Lost Cause movement. And so it makes him a relatively easy target. Douglass does attack in print a couple of other individuals. Joseph Kershaw comes to mind in 1870, 71, somewhere around there. Kershaw is at a meeting where he is kind of proposing this idea that there be an official history of the Army of Northern Virginia, and they should start collecting these papers. And he gives this prayer, this invocation, and it holds the Confederacy in the present tense. He talks about Lee and Davis to these high regards, and Douglass attacks him on that front. But I think it is worth noting with that example, Douglass was very much in favor of former Confederates recording their history. He makes it very clear time and again that he does not oppose meetings of Confederate veterans so long as they are, consolidating records from the war, official correspondence, official reports, things of that nature. He very much liked the idea of former Confederates gathering with one another if it was for the betterment of understanding the Civil War era. But he does take issue with any of those commanders like Kershaw in that case of making it something more than that, making the Confederacy sound like it was still alive if they were given the ability to record its history.
We've got a follow-up from Dave Carino. So if Lee had lived longer, would Douglass have criticized him so harshly?
It's possible not. It's possible not. At least it's possible we wouldn't have as definitive a record of it. I think 3 or 4 of the excerpts that I provided tonight were from public speeches that were not in the realm of that newspaper, but because he did have that easy accessibility, once a week he printed a paper, and for 6-7 weeks in a row he has something to say about Lee. So it's quite possible that if Lee dies after Douglass is not printing the New National Era anymore, I doubt he would have had any more of a positive opinion of him, but we probably just wouldn't have the physical evidence. And I think that's one of the important things about why we should consider Douglass's words, even if folks disagree with them, is because they do exist at all, because he did take the time to write them as an eminent figure of his time. So it is interesting for us to see something that might be contrary to the typical idea that we have of how people looked at Lee in the 19th century in the immediate aftermath of his death. But yeah, it is a great what if. And on the flip side of that, you can look at people like Jubal Early or John Gordon, who were these biggest proponents of the lost cause. That Lee dies relatively soon after the war does give them an opportunity to lionize him just that much earlier at the birth of that kind of movement of the lost cause. So I think that the timing of his death almost works both ways.
I have a question from Stephen Krause. Can you speak to the parallel between Lee's favorable reputation in the North and Grant's in the South as the two who, quote, ended the war?
Yeah, Lee, for about 5 years or so, I mean, really, you could almost line it up perfectly with his death. If you read a lot of, kind of looking at the press as kind of the mouthpiece of the people, at least that's the easiest way we have access to the thoughts of individuals. Editorials, people writing to newspapers, especially Union veterans, very much opposed to Lee, especially when he takes the presidency at Washington College. They felt as though he was let down way too easily. John Underwood, who was a judge in Virginia, does have an indictment against Lee, and I think it's something like 35, 36 other Confederate officers who had served in the Virginia theater of the war. He was only able to attempt to prosecute people who served at the seat of the Confederate government. So this would exclude largely those who served predominantly in the Western theater of the war. And as all that is happening, Lee is held in the court of public opinion in a relatively low esteem. And I think we can easily forget that today because he does become this nationally appreciated figure in many regards. Grant, what we basically see is, of course, is demonized kind of in the immediate aftermath of the conflict for having, as Southerners saw, waged war upon the South. But as time goes on, and he is seen as this, relatively reconciliationist figure, let us have peace, his presidential campaign slogan. There are anecdotes about Lee telling folks, and Charles Flood in his book Lee the Last Years has a few of these examples where when Lee was in the presence of people who spoke ill of Grant, he would walk away or he would discourage people from doing that. And so in many regards, I would say that having these bigger figure former Confederates like Lee speaking very highly of Grant, that elevates his perspective as well, or his kind of the light on him. I don't have as much in my course of study beyond that, but those are just a couple of the trends that I have seen.
Okay, we have a comment from Ellen Connolly that Lee used Grant's terms of surrender as a way of saying that he cannot be charged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what we see here, and one of the books there, John Reeves's Lost Indictment of Robert E. Lee, goes into, I think it's a better part of an entire chapter about this. And Grant, and this is another reason why Grant was favorably seen, was that he went to bat whenever he was president, especially, and even just right before his presidency, to say that he felt that way as well, that the terms of the surrender were such that Lee could not be prosecuted. And how the legislative and judicial bodies look at this matter is that was a military agreement. And what Grant and Lee agreed to could not be taken to a higher political realm. That was up to the other branches of the United States government, not the civilian government, not within the confines of the military. And so there is this big debate over that. Grant, whenever he's general in chief of all the armies, he threatens his resignation at one point in time if Lee is convicted. And even ultimately, the story of Lee not being convicted has not much to do with whether there was a case against him or not, but really the fact that William Seward is given as Secretary of State a copy, what he thought was a copy of the indictment, but ends up being the original one. And he hands it to a friend of his, he says is basically a gift. And it's placed in the War Department files or the State Department files, I forget which, for several decades until it's eventually found in the National Archives, well after all these folks were dead. I think it's in the 1930s it was uncovered. And that is ultimately one of the primary reasons why Robert E. Lee is not indicted for treason, is that the document is misplaced and mishandled. So talk about a great what if of history. What if that document is not mishandled? And even the timing of Lee's death. If he lives a little longer, are there even greater cries for his possible indictment? He fears that he will be indicted. He does receive, if you look through Lee's papers, even the published papers, there are all these letters to him, people saying, I will represent you if you are tried for treason. And he takes the he takes the advice, legal advice. In many instances, he feels that there is a almost constant threat to the fact that he could be arrested at just about any given time. And there's even a period of time where during the Lincoln assassination, the trial for the conspirators, that Lee's name is thrown out there time and time again as a possible conspirator. And of course, there does not seem to be any evidence of that, but he was aware of this. And he talks to a reporter in the days just after returning to Richmond about the fact that I'm aware that I could be tried for treason. I could be tried for being potentially in the realm of people who wanted to assassinate the president. So all of that comes into play as well.
Andrew, do you see anybody out there waving desperately to ask a question?
No, I'm just seeing lots of comments that of people just saying how much they enjoyed the program, and more than written text. We definitely want to give voice to that. What a fabulous presentation! Fabulous presentation. Well done.
Yeah.
And that's the comments are rolling in about how great that is.
Thank you, everyone.
Great questions too. People, man, what a smart group of people that these are great questions.
Put me on the spot. Yeah, some further research for me too. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I remember reading a book on spying for the Union about the Army of the Potomac's intelligence unit. I can't remember the name of the author, but I do remember that when Lee surrendered, they were writing paroles for all of the men and the officers furiously, and they thought they had everybody done. And I think it was Walter Taylor came over and with a note reminding them that Robert E. Lee too was a member of the Army of Northern Virginia, waiting for his parole papers. So anyways, I see lots of these great comments coming in. And again, I want to go back to Dave Carino, who is our resident expert on Robert E. Lee, who says you did a great job. And I
thank you.
Join that. And thank you for enduring this Zoom session with us. So thank you very much. If you were here, I would be presenting you, and everybody's applauding, by the way, with a flag that flew over the Soldiers and Sailors Monument on July 4th and a certificate to that. We'll be sending that to you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate
with our thanks. And unless somebody else has something for the good of the order, I'm going to thank everybody for participating again and remind you that November 11th, very appropriately Veterans Day, we will have an evening with U.S. Grant. And I hope to see you all back then.